This is your introduction to organic chemistry. For those of you who have taken grade 12 chemistry, you've already got probably the basics that are going to be covered on this particular PowerPoint. For those of you who have not, this will be new material. Again, I will try to make it applicable to what we need to learn in biology, and you may or may not find that that overlaps with what you already know from your chem course. By definition, organic chemistry is the study of carbon containing compounds. We do not include the carbonates, and you are all familiar, at least somewhat, with carbonates from grade 10, where it was part of our Nick the Camel. Organic molecules tend to have carbon and hydrogen, and then only a few other elements such as nitrogen, which we'll see quite a lot in our amino acids, our proteins, when we look at those large, or when we look at our biomolecules. Oxygen, which we find in all four of our large categories of organic molecules, or biomolecules rather. So in our carbs, our proteins, our lipids, and our nucleic acids. And sulfur, something that we also see in our proteins primarily, and occasionally some of the halogen materials. Even though we have only a few elements that we're working with, we have a lot more organic molecules on the planet than we have inorganic, and that is mainly a function of carbon itself, that it can form long chains of many carbons with lots of different configurations. Also, carbon can form single, double, and triple bonds, which gives it a certain versatility. The graphic here is illustrating a triglyceride, or a fat. All right, here are a few electronegativity numbers that may come in handy when you start to consider whether some of the slides coming up are going to contain functional groups that may give some polarity to hydrocarbons. So we already know that a little bit about electronegativity, and we're going to see some of that applied today. So functional groups are groups of particular configurations that can attach to these long chain carbon molecules and give them some particular characteristics. So things that we understand will happen if these particular functional groups are attached to the carbon chains. So again, depending on that particular group, we can predict what might happen if it is attached to a carbon chain. So the example that I've got here is a group that we call the hydroxyl group, which we'll be looking at in a few minutes, and we're going to add that to some carbon and hydrogen. So in this case, we see a carbon and a hydrogen, and we can see that carbon is 2.5, or has an electronegativity number of 2.5. Hydrogen has an electronegativity number of 2.1, and we're familiar with those after our last day in class. And so the difference between them is very slight, and we already know that carbon and hydrogen tend to form structures that have similar bond angles, so we tend not to get polarity there. So again, this idea that we can see that there is a difference here, but because of bond angles, they tend to form non-polar molecules. So what we need to do if we want to, or if we're trying to add some, say, solubility in water to an organic molecule made just of carbon and hydrogen, we may want to add a functional group such as OH, and OH with oxygen and hydrogen has a lot more difference in the electronegativity numbers, and we get that polarity in that particular molecule. And if we add this to our carbon-hydrogen background, then we add some solubility to that compound. So the example that's here is an alcohol. We can see the OH group at one end, and we've got CH2 in the middle and CH3 at the end. That's an example from our previous PowerPoint, and this is ethyl alcohol. All right, so we're going to look at some particular functional groups. The first is the hydroxyl group that we were just referring to in our example on the other page. We already know that it is a polar functional group because of the electronegativity difference between oxygen and hydrogen. Because of that polarity, it becomes a water-loving group that is hydrophilic. If it was water-hating, we would call it hydrophobic. Very common in organic molecules and in our large biomolecule groups that we're going to look at. We'll see them over and over again, particularly in the carbohydrate groups. And we can sort of change this group around, lose that hydrogen, and oxidize the hydroxyl group into something called an aldehyde or a carboxylic acid, and we'll be looking at those further on. There's our example from the other page. This is ethyl alcohol, and it's soluble in water. This is the kind of alcohol that one would find in wine or that kind of so drinking alcohol. Next, we have the carbonyl group, and we can see it's a C double bonded to an oxygen. We're going to find that it is going to take a terminal or an end location on aldehydes, and we'll see that when we do our carbohydrates as well. We're going to find it in various locations, not on the end, but somewhere in the middle of the chain, of the chain, carbon chain, in something called ketones, and we'll be looking at those in a little bit. And we're going to see that a carbonyl group is always found in the linear form, at least, of hexose sugars that we're going to be looking at. So glucose, fructose, and galactose, which we saw in the previous PowerPoint, all contain a carbonyl group when they are in linear form, and we'll see the sort of impact that has. So here's what it looks like when we're going to be connecting it to other molecules. We can see that the carbon is going to be connected to maybe one or maybe another carbon or a hydrogen, depending on where it's located. Our next group is the carboxyl group, and you often see it written like this, COOH. It's a little bit difficult to show the bonding like this. I've got a visual coming up for you in a minute. Carboxyl groups are present in carboxylic acids. They're weakly acidic, meaning that they'll donate protons a little bit in solution, and we will be looking at organic acids and organic bases in another PowerPoint. So an example of something that would have a carboxyl group on it would be vinegar, and that carboxyl group would be drawn like this if we were using it in a structural formula. So the COOH that I have written next to the name is really drawn like this graphic at the bottom of the page. Next, we have the amino or amine group, and you see it referred to both as amine and amino, and it has a nitrogen in it, nitrogen with some hydrogen. The amine group acts like a base, and it's going to accept protons from solution, only slightly again, so it's going to be a component in our organic bases. And this graphic, we're seeing the structural formula of how the nitrogen group, that amino group, might be attached to a carbon chain. The R here refers to any kind of carbon chain that that you could imagine. So R is like a substitute, it's kind of like a variable letter for any number of possible carbon chains. Next, we've got the sulfhydryl group. And that group is one that you're familiar with, even if not in name, probably in smell. It's the group that gives the rotten egg smell. The group itself is very important in stabilizing protein structure. We're going to see that we get disulfide linkages in our protein that helps proteins keep shape. And we've already mentioned how important shape is for biological systems. So again, we're seeing a graphic here where we've got the sulfur attached to the hydrogen and also to an R group, which could represent any kind of carbon chain. The last one that we're going to look at is a phosphate group, and the phosphate group is going to come up quite a few times in various roles. Organic phosphates are able to store and transfer energy, and if you have a look at the phosphate graphic there, the group that's represented there, you can see there's a lot of negatives. And when we start putting phosphate groups together, it takes a lot of energy to form those bonds and keep them together because negative charges tend to repel. So an example of an energy molecule that uses phosphate groups would be ATP. You might have heard of it before. Here is a graphic showing us what ATP looks like. I mean, we'll be looking at this further. In the blue, we've got an adenine, which is actually a base. We can see the nitrogen on the ring structures there. So that's a basic structure. In the middle in green, we see a ribose sugar, which is a 5-carbon sugar. So we'll look at that when we do our carbs. And we are going to see at the other end with the orange circles representing 3 phosphate groups. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. There are 3 phosphate groups present there, and look at all those negatives lined up. So lots of energy stored in those bonds. Okay, when we start talking about organic molecules, usually we start talking about hydrocarbons, and those are long chains usually of carbon and hydrogen with no other elements present, so no functional groups, just hydrocarbons all on their own. Now, hydrocarbons are because they have no functional groups attached, are basically water-hating substances. They don't dissolve well in water, so they are hydrophobic. And generally, we divide them into 3 different families, and the naming of these are quite complex, and we're not going to get into that. But just as sort of an overview, we divide them into those 3 families based on what kinds of bonds are formed between the carbons. So in the alkane family, we have single bonds only. And there's some examples here, methane, ethane, and propane that you're probably familiar with. The meth, eth, and prop are prefixes that are going to tell us how many carbon are present in the molecule. So meth meaning 1, eth meaning 2, and prop meaning 3. And the A and E ending tells us that they are alkanes, meaning we're anticipating there are only single bonds in those molecules. Then we have molecules that contain at least 1 double bond. They're called alkenes. And you can see that we're using the same prefixes here, eth, prop, and in this case we've got bute, which is 4 rather than the meth. We don't have methene because there is only 1 carbon, so we wouldn't have any double bonds. So bute is the prefix for 4. And we can see here ethene, propene, and butene. And these are named very simply. Generally, they'll be something that will indicate where the triple bond is. Now, that's not necessary in ethene because there's only 1 place for it. And also not necessary in well, it can be. Often not used in the propene version. But with butene, we would need to know where the double bond was located, i.e. between carbon number 1 and 2, and so on. In this case, it's being shown in the middle. So at least 1 double bond. And the last kind, as you probably guessed, is a kind of hydrocarbon that contains at least 1 triple bond, and we call them alkynes. And again, we're seeing those prefixes, eth, prop, and bute in this case. We can see the ending is Y-N-E, ine, just like alkynes, and I forgot to say above, the ENE for alkenes, again telling us what kind of bond that we're looking for, that double bond. And in the case of ines, we're looking at the location or the fact that there is a triple bond in there. So ethyne, propyne, and butane, and we can see again we've got the triple bonds there. All right, so if we start adding some functional groups into those hydrocarbon chains, then we get some interesting things happening. So we'll go through some of the more common organic families. This is not exhaustive, but touches on most of what we're going to need. So first we'll look at alcohols. We've already talked a little bit about those. We know they're hydrophilic or water-loving. Alcohols that I'm going to show you here are very simple, but they can be quite complex and can have multiple OH groups on them. The more OH groups there are, the more soluble the alcohol is in water. The examples here are a little bit fuzzy to see. We've got methanol, and you can see those same prefixes here. Meth, M-E-T-H, telling me there's one carbon, and O-L is the ending for alcohol. So methanol, ethanol. In this case, we have two carbon groups. The next one we've got down here is propanol, and we've got 3 carbons here. And we've got a variation on that, isopropanol. And in this case, we still have the same number of carbon, but we can see the OH group, instead of being on an end, a terminal end, is on the middle carbon. So it's a variation on the alcohol. And isopropanol is rubbing alcohol, so you might be familiar with that. And then there's a couple of other examples underneath that. Ethers don't have the OH group, but that O is contained between the carbons within the carbon chain. And we can see a couple of ethers in our example in our graphic at the bottom here, and they have kind of a neat way of being named. They have ether rate in the name, so you can tell that they are ethers, and the naming is related to the groups that are on either side of the oxygen. So in the top example, we've got one methyl group on one side, one methyl group on the other side, so methyl group being CH3 group, and so we call it dimethyl ether. And underneath that, we've got an example where we've got methyl group on one end, so one carbon with 3 hydrogen, and then we've got an ethyl group on the other end, that's with 2 carbons, and so we've got ethyl methyl ether. Next, we're going to look at aldehydes and ketones. Both of these molecules, or both of these compounds, are going to contain a carbonyl group. That was the carbon double bonded to an oxygen. In aldehydes, the carbonyl group is located on a terminal carbon, and when we're naming these, we use an Al in the name. So an example at the bottom of the page is hexanol, Al, rather than Ol, so don't get it mixed up with alcohols. And we can see in this case, we've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as we would expect with the hex. We've got 6 carbon, and the final carbon at one end has the double bond O attached to it, and we see the final hydrogen finishes off the 4 bond requirement for carbon. For a ketone, we also have that carbonyl group, as I mentioned, but it's not located on an end. And when we name these, we name them with an ONE at the end. So hexanone, if we look at this, we can see that we've got our 6 carbon again, but the double bond O is in one of the sort of internal carbons rather than on the end. Carboxylic acid and esters. We are looking here at basically the carboxyl group as the functional group that creates these large families. So carboxylic acid, I mentioned earlier in the PowerPoint, is going to be a weak organic acid, and the carboxyl grouping, that C double bond O, C bonded to OH grouping, is going to be what gives us that acidic nature. So again, this graphic's a little bit blurry, but you can see the first one, the common name for this is formic acid, and we've got the carboxyl group on the end attached just to one hydrogen. So this is a single carbon acid. And again, these are common names for these acids. There are proper standard names for them too. Acetic acid or vinegar is the next one down. We can see there are 2 carbons in that, and one of those carbons is part of the carboxyl group. And then we've got butyric acid underneath that, where we've got 4 carbons, and one of those carbons is part of the carboxylic acid or carboxyl group. Esters contain the carboxyl group as well, but minus one of the hydrogen because it is embedded into the sort of middle of the carbon chain. Esters are a major component of fats and oils, and we're going to be looking at those when we do our lipid grouping, biomolecule. And they can be made from carboxylic acids and alcohols. And the little chart at the bottom, again, I know that's quite small, but in grade 12 chemistry, sometimes they actually create these esters and they have very lovely smells. So you can take particular alcohols and acids, put them together and get smells like banana, peaches, pears, apples, and so on. So here are some examples at the top of some esters, and we can see that we've got the C double bond O, single bond O arrangement in the middle of a chain, and you can see there the way that they are named with the what's on one side of the carboxyl group and on the other side of the carboxyl group. Last but not least, amino acids and amine groups. So the amine group we looked at earlier, we didn't, is NH2. And, oh yes we did, sorry, pardon me. The amine group that we looked at earlier with the NH2 is derived from ammonia and becomes a component of a hydrocarbon chain. There's a couple of examples here in this graphic. We got propylamine, we've got a butylamine, and we've got another variation on a propylamine. And in all of these cases, we can see the nitrogen groups that are attached to long carbon chains. Amino acids are something we're going to be looking at a lot when we do our protein biomolecules. Amino acids are kind of an interesting grouping. They're maybe not so much a general family, they're a lot more specific. And they have two functional groups. They have the NH2 group, which has sort of a basic quality to it, and they have the carboxyl group, which has the acidic quality to it. So it has an acid end and it has a basic end, and they are the main components in proteins. And here's a general format of what we see when we look at amino acids. So on the left side of this particular drawing, we are seeing an amine group, and on the right-hand side, we're seeing a carboxylic acid group. In the center, we've got a carbon that has an R attached to it, and remember I said that R is like a variable, and there can be multiple things. There's 21 or 22 different variations on what could be found at the location here designated R. All right, folks, that's the end of our intro. Jot down any questions you have, and we'll discuss them in class tomorrow.